All right, excellent. So I have Stephan Schwartz, who has projects with remote viewing, and we all know we love remote viewing on this channel. So Stephan, thank you for doing this interview and having
Happy
this
to do
discussion
it.
with me. Yeah. So just if we could jump right into it, can you tell us about an active project that you have that spiked my interest, and I'm sure a lot of people who saw these other interviews that you have on the internet.
I think you're talking about remote viewing the future, visions of the future.
Yeah, well, we all saw the 2060 that you were doing 2060, taking a series of remote viewers and viewing the future. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I started in 1978 um, asking people to look at the year 2050 on the same date as the session that we did. So if it were the 16th of July, I'd say, Chris, can you go forward to the 16th of July 2050 and can you describe what you see? And I did 4,000 people around the world and was very struck by what they told me, which contradicted most of what people thought. And everything that they have told me consensually, again, this is the technique is not an individual, but it's to get where you have consensus from many different individuals. It's exactly the same technique that's used by the intelligence community or by investigative reporters or anybody that's trying to wade through data to get to an accurate description. So the consensus that they gave me, everything that they have told me has either come to pass or is in the process of coming to pass.
Hmm. So you look for patterns in the data, you take a
Yes.
massive amount of data, and the first thing that comes to mind is, are you using experienced remote viewers like with coordinates, or are you doing a different method where you have them calm themselves and go into a state? Because everyone defines remote viewing differently. So
Yes, the first thing I need to tell you is most of what you hear about remote viewing is maybe commercially interesting, but I deal with what science knows about remote viewing, and there is no one way to remote view. People have been remote viewing since the 5th century BCE that we know of. The oldest recorded remote viewing is in the 46th chapter of Herodotus's Histories of the World, written in the 5th century BCE. And it's about basically exactly the same experiment that we would do today. We would call it an outbound protocol, in which Croesus, the king of the Lydians, went to the oracles of Greece and asked them a question, and they gave him exactly the kind of answer you would expect to see today. So, the first thing I need to make sure you understand is that there is no one way to remote view. There is no best way to remote view. There is no secrets to remote viewing. Um, the key to all of it, and the many different ways to do it, is the ability to attain and sustain intention focused awareness. That's why meditators routinely do better than non meditators, because meditators learn how to attain and sustain intention focused awareness. So you can remote view any way you like. There is no best way. I interviewed 4,000 people, some of whom were experienced remote viewers, some of whom had never done it before. And I would explain to them what I wanted them to do, and they would do it.
and there's almost a beginner's luck aspect to it, I noticed as well.
There is what is known as the first time effect. Uh, in doing remote viewing, when people have never done it before, they have no expectation of what's going to happen, and so they often they don't develop analytical judgments or attitudes about it, and so they tend to produce high quality data. It's called the first time effect.
That's interesting. I mean, are you utilizing that in your current projects now with looking out to the future, or do you have like a network of remote viewers that you've already worked with that can kind of do it on their own?
Both.
Okay. All right. Um, Yeah, it's always a challenge because with a new person, you first have to convince them that this is a thing. You have to educate them, and I could see how doing a massive project can be a little challenging. Because when you said 4,000 people, I thought, well, how do you go through 4,000 people, man? You know?
Well, I travel around the world, and when I went to conferences, I would get people to do it, or I would interview individuals and ask them to do it, and then I would transcribe the information, and I'm looking for consensus. I mean, if you
Okay.
heard an explosion outside of your wherever it is you are, and you ran out into the street and you saw a crowd of people who had also run out into the street, what would you do? You'd go around and you'd interview individuals independently of one another so that they wouldn't hear what the other person said. And what you would be looking for is consensus. We know, for instance, there are a lot of variables. We know, for instance, that women are more likely to get the color of a car correct and men the brand of the car. So we know that people who are highly analytical are more likely to produce analytical overlay, which isn't useful. The key to remote viewing is not to try to figure out what it is you're looking at, but simply to report the sense impressions. And as I tell people, you know, if I ask you, can you remember the first time you took somebody that you were in love with out to dinner? Can you do that?
Barely. Yeah, I could. Yeah, I could.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you remember the person that you went out with?
Yes.
Do you remember what they look like?
Yes.
Can you picture where you took them?
Yes, of course.
That's remote viewing.
Yeah.
It's just like that.
Yeah.
Remote viewing is like looking at a memory or having a memory or recalling a past experience. And the more emotionally engaging it is, the more likely you are to recall it. Remote viewing, when you look at targets which are numinous, that is, that are numinosity is an informational enrichment process. The key to thinking about this is to understand that consciousness is causal and fundamental, as Max Planck told us in 1931, and also Einstein, most of the other German leaders who created modern physics, and Americans. Einstein called reality an optical delusion. When he was interviewed, Max Planck said, they asked him what did he learn, and he said, what I've learned is that consciousness is causal and fundamental. Space-time arises from consciousness, not consciousness from space-time. So you realize that what we're looking at and what we call reality are information architectures that are created by intentioned consciousness. So when you're remote viewing, what you're doing is opening to the non-local aspect of consciousness, the part of you, what religion calls the soul, what I might call the eternal self. It is that aspect of self which existed before you incarnated, exists while you are incarnated, and continues after you're physically dead. So part of this is about the continuity of consciousness. We also know from research that although time and space are informational enrichers, that is, they provide information that's interesting, they are not limitations. It's just as easy to describe a teacup that's in the next room as it is something on another planet. The difficulty with describing something on another planet is you can't check it. But we know from research that has been done that people who described situations on other planets, which were then checked by NASA space probes, turned out to be correct.
And it's interesting how once you get into the applications with remote viewing and consciousness, how how did you rephrase it, non-local consciousness and observing things at a distance, how it spills over into the spiritual aspects of consciousness, and how you just described it as well. And you mentioned reincarnation, and it kind of intertwines. It's like most people would start remote viewing trying to use it for lottery ticket winnings, stock market stuff. And then as they get deeper and deeper, this is what happened with me. You all of a sudden you dive into spirituality because it's all connected. And I
Well,
noticed
because
that's
spirituality, what we call spirituality, is non-local consciousness. I mean, if you
okay.
look at religions, what you discover is that all religions begin because a single individual has a non-local consciousness experience.
Right.
Jesus gets baptized by John, and he goes out into the desert and meditates, and he awakens. Uh, Buddha goes to an ashram and is taught meditation, and he meditates and awakens. Muhammad goes to a sacred cave, the Hira cave, and he has a non-local experience, and he awakens. Joseph Smith goes to a sacred grove, and he awakens. It's all about the idea that consciousness is causal and fundamental. And what religions do is they take the spiritual experiences, with what they call spiritual experiences, non-local consciousness experiences, and if you look at religious services, what you discover is when you strip away the dogmas that they hold, is it one God, is it more than one God, is it all of that dogmatic belief stuff. When you strip all that away, what you get down to is that all religions basically have the same basic principles. You gather together at a location that is a church, a synagogue, a temple, or with the Etruscans, an oak grove. Doesn't make any difference. The reason that you gather in that space is that you make the space what a religion would call sacred. That is, the acts of individual observation that people have collectively when they gather together changes the informational structure of the reality of that space. We know, for instance, from the neuroscience research, that when people sing together, dance together, drum together, chant together, pray together, that their brains all become entrained. That is, they all reflect the same patterns. And so, if you think about it, you go to church, you begin by making a statement of shared belief. It's, the Nicene Creed if you're a Christian. The hierarchy of voodoo if you're a voodoo practitioner. It doesn't make any difference. The formulations of religion change and are different from culture to culture, but fundamentally it's all about the same thing. It's about awakening to this aspect of consciousness that is normally overpowered by the sensorial perceptions. It's hot, it's cold, it's noisy, it's quiet, it's bright, it's dark, all those kinds of things. Normally, most of our what we call thinking, which isn't really thinking, is driven by the sensorial impressions of our neuroanatomy. But when you learn how to attain and sustain intention-focused awareness, and there are any number of techniques for doing that, meditation being probably the most general and easiest. When you do that, then all that sense impression stuff slides into the background, and you allow yourself to open to the aspect of consciousness which is eternal. This eternal part of yourself, as I say, the soul or the higher self, Edgar Cayce called it, or the eternal self, or whatever, because we are ultimately expressions of consciousness. The whole principle of what's going on here, I mean, I'm one of the people that created remote viewing, and I did and Russ Targ and Hal Puthoff, Jim Spottiswoode, Ed May, this little group of guys that created it. We started doing this because at the time we began, which is back in my case 1968, in the case of Russ and Hal in the early 70s, James about the same time. At that point, people who were doing experiments which invoked non-local consciousness were reporting what was called the decline effect. That is, the more you did it, the worse you got at it. So
Right.
when you were asking people to guess cards, the Zener cards, or dice throws, or that kind of stuff, and the reason that you got worse at it is it was boring. And so you got bored. So we wanted to create a technique that, we weren't in together. We did this all independently. But, in my case, I started because of the Edgar Cayce material that I had spent 4 years reading. I understood from him that all the senses report, and that if it was interesting, you tended to do better. So in any case, we did this because we wanted to get past the decline effect. We wanted to be able to get better as we went along with it. And so that's what we did. And it was the word remote viewing, the term was coined by Ingo Swann. It's a terrible term, by the way, because it has nothing to do with remote and has nothing to do with viewing. But that's where our understanding was in the early 1970s when Ingo coined that. I called it distant viewing back in the 60s. That's wrong too, because as I said, it has nothing to do with distance except as an informational component. It's not a limitation. It's just as easy, as I said, to describe something that's close or something far away. And it's also, we know from the research that I've done, that it's entirely possible for people to go back in time thousands of years and describe down to 15th, 16ths of an inch.
And that's
where
what you've done
something
with
is located.
and that's what you've done with these projects. With you've done archaeological digs and discoveries.
Yes. We found Cleopatra's Palace, Mark Antony's Palace, the Lighthouse of Pharos, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, Pompey's Pillar, one of Christopher Columbus's caravels. Yes, you're putting up Opening to the Infinite. Opening to the Infinite tells you everything science knows about remote viewing.
Okay. And the other thing you were talking about was that the project with Alexandria, or looking for the book here, with your archaeological projects?
Well, that's one of the novels, Awakening, which is about aliens. That's everything I know about aliens and consciousness. And I wrote it as a novel because I couldn't prove it in an objectively verifiable way. But that's all about why we're having alien contacts and why there's so much interest in UFOs now. And
Oh, wow. So with Alien, I didn't know that that you had any active projects, or I guess older projects with Alien. How would you summarize it? Why would
well,
have these?
I've got people to do some remote viewing about this, and I also looked at the way aliens were behaving, and they behave exactly like cultural anthropologists studying a primitive culture. And why are they doing it? And I think the answer to that is because all cultures, wherever they are, and there must be thousands of them, and we're certainly not the only sentient beings, that they develop technologically and they get to a point where they can either destroy themselves or they can awaken to the fact that consciousness is causal and fundamental and begin to alter their technologies. And we're at that edge of the cliff. We're at the whatever metaphor you want.
Okay.
We're at a place where we're either going to wake up and understand that we don't have dominion over the earth. We are in fact linked within a matrix of life in which all life is interconnected and interdependent, and we're going to begin to develop our technologies so that we support the well-being of the planet. I mean, I will tell you The main thing I have learned from 50 years of research, and I've been doing this since 1968, over 50 years actually, is the key is to support and foster well-being. Whenever you make a choice, you want your choice to be compassionate, life-affirming, and fostering of well-being, because that's the way you create, that you support the matrix of life. And we're at a stage now where we're either going to destroy ourselves as a species, or we're going to wake up and we're going to begin to do things which support and foster well-being. That's the big takeaway from remote viewing.
So the aliens are essentially seeing what we do. They're just waiting to see
They're just
which direction we're
watching
going to
us.
go.
Yeah, they're watching us, just like when, anthropologists would go study a primitive culture, I don't know, in New Guinea or someplace. What
Right.
would you do? You don't march in, you stay on the periphery, you observe, you bring in people that they call informants, and you ask them and talk to them about what's going on, or you observe what's going on. But you don't want to intrude too much into it, because then that distorts the behavior. And so that's exactly why we're suddenly seeing all of these new reports that are coming in about UFOs. Why is there more? Because we're at that tipping point stage, and it's not clear which way we're going to go.
And they seem to also, I noticed, there's a lot of people who do channelings and they connect, even through remote viewing, traditional remote viewing. They're able to have certain dialogues with the
Yes.
aliens, and they seem more advanced. Like remote viewing is, or as you said, consciousness, perception, whatever you want to name it. They're proficient at it, it would seem.
Yes.
Like
Well, because anybody that has the ability to travel through space like that at those distances must have come to a point where they have survived this tipping point that we now face, and have survived it and prospered. And they're looking at us to see, is humanity going to destroy itself, or is it going to awaken? And the reason that I started doing these Visions of the Future project was that in 1978, when I left government, the book you've got up now, Secret Vaults of Time, that's the book that I wrote when I first began to do this, because I wanted to explore everything that had been done before my getting involved. At that time, I didn't know another person who did this. So this book that you've got up, Secret Vaults of Time, is the story of all the cases that I could find of people that used, they didn't call it remote viewing, but used what I would properly call non-local perception, and how they used that to find archaeological sites. Why archaeology? Because I wanted to do an experiment which was unequivocally triple blind, and in which you could establish an absolutely unimpeachable chronology of the event, because criticism was, oh, well, you somehow you told them, or you cued them in some way, your facial expression, or something you said, or so I wanted to develop a technique in which there was absolutely no question that no one knew the answer, and yet you could get information and follow it up by field work and resolve the question and discover whether, in fact, it was objectively verifiably accurate.
Yeah, I mean, if you're treasure hunting and you discover treasures, you obviously have a good methodology, so I guess that would validate it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
So,
treasure hunting has problems, because the other thing that people don't seem to get about remote viewing is that the implication of remote viewing is there are no secrets.
yeah.
And
Right.
so if you're doing treasure hunting as an example, what you stimulate is greed. And because people are greedy.
Right.
And so that distorts their ability to do the remote viewing. Because remote viewing, when you set up a remote viewing experiment, both the experimenter, whoever's setting it up, and the people who are providing the data, the remote viewers, they are linked in a kind of biocircuit in which their intentionality and attitudes are linked together, and the experimenter is as big a force to affect the outcome as the viewer is because of the creation of the biocircuit. So you want to be very careful in trying to do get rich quick schemes, because it stimulates greed, and greed stimulates secrets and partnerships to, will you help me do this, and we won't tell the other people, and all that kind of stuff.
Of course, yes.
And so it tears the thing apart. Integrity, part of what I have learned from doing remote viewing, I mean, all of this doesn't seem to be about remote viewing, but it is that integrity is absolutely essential. You must be 100% in public who you are in private.
So how does this all tie into, for instance, the project that you're doing with viewing 2060? I know you were doing 2050 for a very long time, and you've had success over the years because you've seen it manifest over time, and I've watched that. And I'm also curious because I know you've mentioned AIDS in the other video, and you've seen how that came to progress, and then how the social changes that we see today. But where did you, by any chance, did you catch the 2020 madness? Did that come up when you were viewing 2050?
2020, I don't know what 2020 madness you're
Well,
speaking.
unfortunately we have to use keywords here. I can't use I don't know what YouTube restricts now whenever you bring up, but 2020. I guess
You
you
mean
could say
political things?
the pandemic, everything that
Oh, yes,
changed the
absolutely.
world.
Yes,
So
the
that did
remote
come up.
viewers. In fact, I will tell you a very specific story.
Okay.
When I looked at the 2050, well, let me tell you why I began doing this also.
Okay.
I was in government. I was the special assistant for research and analysis to the Chief of Naval Operations. Two of them, actually. One, Admiral Zumwalt and Admiral Holloway. And I was also asked to serve on the Secretary of Defense, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, working study group on innovation technology in the future, and also the Smithsonian study group on innovation technology in the future. So I was, and I held security clearances at a fairly high level, quite high level. And I came away when I left government in 1976. I came away convinced we were going to have a nuclear war. And in fact, were it not for one Soviet colonel who didn't push the button when he was told to do so, we would have had World War III. And this would all be a very, very different world. He didn't do it. But in any case, I was convinced, as were most people in the geopolitical world who had access to the kind of information I had access to, that we were very likely to have a nuclear war, either by mistake, somebody doing something stupid, or because of intention. And you see Putin currently threatening nuclear war.
Right.
So I thought, well, this is going to happen, and I'd like to know. I was married, I had a child, and I thought, well, I'd like to know when this is likely to happen. And so I started doing, because as I said, I'm one of the people who created remote viewing. And I thought, well, I'll use this technique to see what the future looks like, and is my daughter going to be okay? So I started getting people to remote view, and I didn't want to go too far into the future because I had just recently at that time discovered that Jules Verne, who wrote 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, had also written a novel, basically a remote viewing novel, of Paris in the 1960s, in which he had said, that this was in the 1850s. He said Paris was, the economy was controlled by corporations, which didn't exist at that time, 1850s. That women worked in corporations, unheard of at that time. That there was no longer horse-drawn traffic, it was done by internal combustion machines, and that people sent, in the 1960s, they sent their business correspondence over, this is really unusual, facsimile machines. Now think about that. He wrote this in 1850, in the 1850s, and he sent it to his editor. He had just published 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which was a huge success. And his editor wrote him back and said, Jules, I got your new novel. I'm not going to publish it. It's so weird, nobody would believe it. It will destroy your reputation. I suggest you just put it away and forget about it. And that's what he did.
Women working?
Well, and internal combustion machines and facsimile machines. Oh, and he said also that Paris was now the central sort of image of Paris was a tall metal tower, the Eiffel Tower, which did not exist at that time. And it just sounded crazy to his editor. So he literally put it away. He put it in a vault, in a little safe. And years later, in the 1960s, as the person that inherited the farm that he had owned went out to the farm, and underneath he saw this little safe. And he said to the tenant farmer who looked after the land, what's in the safe? And the guy said, well, I have no idea. Nobody's ever opened it. My father didn't open it. I've never opened it. So he had a locksmith come out and open the safe up, and he found this manuscript about Paris in the 1960s. And I read this. He published the book and his commentary about how the whole story I just told you. And I realized that if I went too far into the future, I wouldn't understand what they were going to say. I mean, for instance, if in the 1950s, I had told you you could wear something on your wrist which would allow you to contact anybody on Earth practically and get all the news that was going on. I mean, you just thought I was crazy. So I didn't want to go too far in the future. And 2050 seemed like it wouldn't change so much. I looked 50 years earlier and thought, okay, well, if somebody told me something 50 years earlier about 2078 when I began this, I'd still understand what they were saying. And so I began interviewing people. And one of the first things I asked them was, has there been a nuclear war? And because as I said, I was very concerned about that. And they said, no. And I said, well, then is the world safer? Because I thought, well, if there's not a nuclear war, the world must be safer, right? And they said, oh, no, the world is much more dangerous. And I said, why? And they said, because of terrorism. And in 1978, the only terrorism that was going on that anybody paid any attention to was the fight between the Roman Catholics and the Protestants in Ireland. And IRA's, terrorist activities. So terrorism, how could the world be less safe because of terrorism? But of course now it's, obviously the world is less safe because of terror. So then I would say, I said things like, well, tell me about health care. And I was worried about that because at that point I had a handicapped brother I took care of, retarded, had all kinds of medical problems, and I was looking after him. And so I said, well, tell me about health care. And they said, oh, well, it's completely different. And I said, well, are people healthier? And they said, well, yes and no. I said, what do you mean? And they said, well, there are these pandemics. I said, pandemics? What do you mean? Well, there are all these pandemics and they kill millions of people. And I said, well, I don't know, tell me about them. And they said, well, this is again consensus. The first one is a blood disease which crosses over from primates to humans and spreads all over the world and kills millions of people. So I went to a friend of mine who was the deputy director of National Institutes of Health and said to him, do you know anything about a blood disease that crosses over from primates to humans that could kill millions of people? This is 1978, 79. And his answer to me was, I don't know what it is you're smoking, but quit. Mm-hmm. Because no, I don't know anything about that. That's just crazy talk. And then, of course, in 1981, AIDS emerges, crosses over from primates to humans, and it eventually kills 35 million people. Then comes SARS, then H5N1, and now we're doing COVID. And there are going to be others because as climate change goes on, viruses and bacteria are going to mutate to accommodate the new circumstances of their lives, and we're going to have more pandemics.
It's true, but I would say that 2020 was especially a marker in human history. It almost would seem like there was political tension, there were riots in the street. It just stood out, and of course the lockdowns. And I couldn't help but think, if you're reviewing the future with all of these people, that they wouldn't mention, if it was somewhat predicted at some level. That's what I was driving at.
Well, they did. Yeah, okay. I didn't ask the question that way, so of course I wouldn't get that kind of answer. Right, I didn't say, what happened in 2020. Right. If I'd asked that, then I would have gotten different. I asked for 2050. Yeah. But what they did say to me was, I said, well, look at the United States and, tell me about the United States. Does it still exist? And they said, well, in form, yes, but real power has devolved down to the states and groups of states because there is what I now call the Great Schism trend, the split between the red states and the blue states. And I just read a paper this morning that most Republicans living in blue states would like to see succession. That is, they would like to have their not blue states, red states. They would like to have their red states succeed from the Union. So I think that what the remote viewers described, which was that the idea that the United States in form still existed, by which I think they mean there's a Senate, there's a House, there's a President, there's a Supreme Court, but that real power has resolved down to the states. Because what's happening in the United States is that the red states and the blue states are schisming, are going very different directions. Look at what's happening with the overturn of Roe, for instance.
Right.
And that's going to have huge implications. And they told me that. They said, well, in some places, healthcare is much better, and in other places, it's not good. And of course, that's exactly what we're going to see with the Roe v. Wade business, because if you're a young doctor or you're an OBGYN who just gets out of their residency, are you going to go to a red state where you could be put in prison for even mentioning to a woman that she might get an abortion or that she's going to need an abortion because her pregnancy threatens her life, or because a 10-year-old child, actually she was 9, was raped and is now pregnant? I mean, look at what this has happened to this doctor in Indiana that actually did the abortion on this 10-year-old girl. She's got threats, people threatening to kidnap her, kill her. So exactly what the remote viewers described. The states are splitting into very different cultures.
Sure. Sure.
And so the 2050s describe this in detail. And then in 1991, I kept going from 2050, from 78 to 91. And then in 2018, I decided I would pick it up again because I also wanted to answer a question that nobody's ever been able to answer in remote viewing, and that is, if someone describes the future, are they describing a fixed future, or are they describing the highest probability event at the time you're asking the question? That is it fixed, or is it a probability? And so I thought if I compare the 2050 data with the 2060 data, I will be able to answer that question, and that's exactly what I'm doing.
So that's an ongoing answer then, right?
I don't know the answer yet.
Okay. Have you seen anything with genetic modification?
Oh, absolutely. Well,
Okay.
I've written about this at length. One of the things that concerns me is the CRISPR technology, the genetic engineering technology, is creating, and it's going to involve rich people first because it's going to be expensive, is going to create another human species, Homo superior. And it is not at all clear to me, and I don't know the answer to this yet, but I can already see it happening, particularly in China and Asia, where they don't have the same cultural limitations about genetic engineering.
Sure.
You know, if you could create a child that was as smart as Einstein and as athletic as, I don't know, Michael Jordan, and that wouldn't get cancer or heart disease because they'd been genetically engineered, this Homo superior, what would happen if there was another another species of human? Would they be dominant, and would Homo sapien be subordinate? Would they become the sort of peasant servants of the Homo superiors? I mean, if you look at what has been done in the United States about wealth inequality, which the remote viewers talked about, I mean, we have 4 people that can run their own space programs, and 1 out of 7 children doesn't have enough to eat. Right. So we have this obscene wealth inequality, and if those 4 wealthy people could engineer their children so that they didn't get any of these heart disease, cancer, whatever, and they had IQs of 170, and they were hugely athletic, what would be the effect of that?
I suppose it would be unfair, but for the sake of progression, human progression, you'd kind of want to see a better human emerge, but not at the I mean, I guess we would be the Neanderthals in this storyline, right?
Exactly.
So, it's like obviously it's sad they're no longer around, but you want obviously the Homo sapiens to prevail because we are Homo sapiens, but
except that if the Homo superior became the dominant controlling species, we are already at a place where we are becoming an oligarchy. I mean, the United States is becoming an anocracy. An anocracy is it appears like a democracy because it has voting, but in fact it's all rigged and controlled by a small group of people. If that were to happen, and Homo superior were to be driving it, yes, it would be very much like the Neanderthal or the Denisovians and Homo sapiens. I mean, we have a number of genes which come from Neanderthal, so there was interbreeding.
Right.
But you don't see Neanderthal anymore. You don't see Denisovians anymore. And so what happens to Homo sapien if the CRISPR technology allows the genetic manipulation to create Homo superior, and it becomes, it's gene lining, that is, it gets passed on from generation to generation.
So, but in Homo superior, was that mentioned in the remote viewing, or was it just described in there's like a new genetic modification, it's coming?
Well, they describe genetic manipulation.
And did they describe the unfairness of it? Or
I didn't. When I was asking in 1978, it didn't even occur to me to ask that question.
All right.
So I'm going to do another, this project isn't over. I'm going to be doing more remote viewing of the future, and I'm going to be asking a different set of questions.
And is this what you put out on? I noticed that a lot of this content is not in your books. Is this what you put out on the Schwartz report?
The Schwartz report is all about www.schwartzreport.net.
.net. Mm-hmm.
Is all about trends which are shaping the future, and yes, I cover all of this.
Okay, and then I'll put the link to that down below. So, you
And I'm going
cover
to
the
write a
trends?
book about. I'm actually in the process, as I'm analyzing the data. I'm also laying out a book, and I'm going to write a book called Visions of the Future.
Is this the book that I have on the screen here?
No,
The vision.
that is a book about a remote viewing project that saves the destruction of Washington D.C.
Ah, okay.
And it is
Is there any
based
truth to it?
on it. Well, it's based on some actual facts.
Okay. All right. Very good. Yeah, you crank out a lot of books. It was hard to find the one I was referencing, the Alexandria project, and I saw you have a ton of books out. So,
I do, and you
yeah.
can also you can go to academia.edu and you can get all my papers. There's hundreds of them, and
Oh.
you can go to YouTube and search on my name, and there are hundreds of interviews.
Yeah, I mean, and I was listening to a bunch of them before we did this one, and I got to tell you, people love the projects that you have going on, the future projects. They love the old ones. So the way they would get access to that is the most directly is through the reports, through the Schwartz report.
You go to Schwartz Report. You go to my personal website www.stephanschwartz.com. You look at my books. Yes, I've been covering this, and I'm now getting increased because I am very concerned about what's going on today.
Of course.
I am increasingly focusing on these trends that are shaping the future, and I'm going to put all this data together and, as I say, put it into a book, which I will be publishing. Well, it takes me about 8 months to write a book, so probably sometime in 2023.
All right, sounds good. Well, Stefan, it was an amazing discussion with you and one of my favorite topics. So, and I hope I'm going to put this up on YouTube so other people can enjoy it. And they have your website, and they can. Does it cost money? The schwartzreport.net?
No, I give it away.
All right, very good. I'll put the links in the description below. And thank you, Stefan. I appreciate
My
your time.
pleasure. You have a good
Perfect.
day. Stay safe and well.
You too. You too. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Just a quick plug, our app is now live in the Play Store and the App Store. You can get it in the description below. I put all the details in there. Thanks.